All right, great. Well, my name is Ross Yelsey. I am Associate Director of Admission and Financial Aid here at Columbia Journalism School. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar to talk more about the Master of Arts program. I know some of you might have attended some of our other program webinars this fall. The MA program is a really special program for people who have experience in journalism and want to take their work to the next level in terms of ambition, scope, and kind of the context and rigor of the reporting. So it's a really great program to spotlight today. I'm really happy to have faculty and alumni from the program here to share more insights into what the kind of student experience will be like if you are a part of the MA program in the future. And the great news is this today is November 12th, which means there's still more than a month and a few days now to get an application together if you're interested in this program or our other programs. December 15th will be our deadline to apply for admission for the MA as well as our other graduate degree programs. So if you're interested in this, please reach out to us at apply.journalism@columbia.edu if you want to know more about the specifics for the admissions process, anything else, and please come to our other webinars about just the ins and outs of the applications itself, and we can give you some more guidance in the next month. So there's plenty of time still to put an application together. I'm really happy to have faculty from the two concentrations within the MA we'll be offering in the 2026-27 year. They are Professor Alexander Stille from the politics concentrations and Professors Alisa Solomon and David Hajdu from the arts and culture concentration. And we also have an alum from each of those concentrations here today. We have Alessandra Shade from the arts and culture concentration and Ana Luisa Albuquerque from the politics concentration here to talk more about their experience actually going through the program. But I think to start, maybe it'd be helpful just to have our faculty introduce themselves for a minute or so. So maybe we could start with Sandro and then have Lisa and David, just a quick kind of grounding in what your background in journalism is and what you teach here. I think Sandro, you have to unmute yourself there. One second.
Hi, I'm Alexander Stille. I've been teaching the MA Politics seminar since it began back in 2005. And in my career, I've done mainly long magazine pieces and books. I've worked on 6 books and done everything from book reviews to business pieces to long New Yorker narrative kinds of pieces. But I would say narrative journalism is more my strength. And we teach that as part of the MA Politics curriculum.
Hmm. Great. And Lisa and David from the arts side.
I think there's somebody in the waiting room, Russ.
Oh,
Um,
they're coming in.
okay. Hi everyone. Glad to meet you. I'm Alisa Solomon. Like Professor Stilla, I've been teaching in the MA program since its inception in the fall of 2005. I came from teaching at the City University and also having been a staff writer at the Village Voice for some 20 years, where I was pretty much weekly theater critic. I have an academic background in theater history and dramatic literature, and I also was writing feature stories on a range of cultural subjects as well as politics, Israel-Palestine conflict, immigration policy, women's sports, kind of all over the place, but with theater and culture always as my home base there. Since then, I've been continuing to write criticism and long features, narratives for theater magazines, the magazine Jewish Currents, The Nation, elsewhere, and also writing books.
Uh, my name is David Hajdu. I came along 18 years ago after Alisa taught the program on her own for 2 years. And I'm a longtime arts writer and editor. I was a top editor at a once great magazine called Entertainment Weekly during its first 10 years and edited for other magazines. And I've been a writer on music, film, and the other arts, mostly in popular culture for some time, a couple of decades. Um, was the music critic for for the Hollywood Reporter, then the music critic for the New Republic for some time, for about 12 years, and I'm now the music critic for The Nation. I've written 8 books of criticism, cultural history, a little fiction, a graphic novel, and love teaching the MA program, which is the program that I wish I had taken myself, and to save me learning some hard lessons in practice. So that's me.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And I think we'll just ask a few questions of the faculty just to get more of a sense of what the Master of Arts program offers and how it differs from the MS programs that we've been talking about for many of our other sessions leading up to now. I guess the first would be just, and all of you can weigh in on this, so whether it's Sandra, Lisa, David, or in whatever order you like. Um, what is the purpose of the MA program? What was kind of the founding objective of this new degree? It was introduced about 20 years ago to the school, but what was kind of the idea behind it and what was kind of the intention for it?
I might speak to that because I was involved in the planning before it started with Nick Lemon, who was then our dean and who was really the creator of the program. Interestingly, there was a debate at the time of whether journalism school should be 1 year or 2 years. And Nick came up with a kind of Solomonic solution of having an optional second year, which would focus on in the first year, the MS program, which is our main program, is one that is traditionally focused on giving people the toolkit of skills that they would need to function professionally in our field. And the thinking was that's great if we teach people to do what they need to do to get a job in the field. But then we're just kind of reproducing the status quo and we're not actually going beyond what's already practiced in the field. And the thinking was that here we are, a journalism school on the campus of one of the great research universities of the world, and we don't take advantage of all of the interesting ideas that are percolating in all these different departments of the university. And so the thinking was to try to bridge that gap and to create a program that for people who wanted an area of specialization and that would begin to let some of that research and thinking that happens in the research university into the journalism classroom, but always with the idea that it be about the writing of journalism, that this curriculum would be customized by people like David and Alisa and myself so that it really is functional to the life of a working journalist. And so can you bring these ideas to bear so that we end up with journalists that are more sophisticated, more knowledgeable, able to question their sources on the basis of understanding of their fields, so they're not simply led around by the nose by the sources that they interview. So that was the initial impulse. One of the things that happened, which was a kind of unexpected, nice surprise, is that initially we expected that many of the people would simply transition from the MS program into the MA program, but we ended up attracting this extraordinary array of students who had been working for several years in the field and were attracted to this type of a program. They ended up being our best applicants. And so the program, without having been conceived this way, really ended up being a program that served very well what ended up being an extraordinary population of students, people who had been working anywhere between, 3 and 10 years, who were feeling like, I want to do what I do better, and I'm not quite sure how to go about it. And they've been exceptional students, have gone on to do exceptional work. So that was kind of the initial thinking behind it from my point of view.
Mhm.
And I'll jump in just to add that maybe the shorthand version of this is that our MS program is for students who need to learn how to become journalists, what the nuts and bolts of reporting and putting together a story are, and the MA is for students who have those skills already and want to learn more deeply about the subject areas that they cover, and to be able to do it, as Sandro said, with more depth and nuance and expertise.
Mhm.
Well, that covers the program pretty thoroughly. I actually don't have anything to add to that.
Great. And just for people who are, watching this right now or watching a video of this in the future and they're kind of thinking about this program, could you talk a little bit more? We've touched on it already, but what are some skills that maybe an experienced journalist who comes into the program will come out of it with in terms of like things they can bring to their work in the future in terms of knowledge of the subject, but are there other kind of journalistic skills that they'll get to sharpen or kind of deepen when they're here?
I'll jump in on that one and say that there's a few things. One is, and maybe we'll get later a little bit into how the curriculum breaks down. But in terms of the specialized arts and culture work, I'd say among the skills, some are more amorphous or harder to describe concretely because they have to do with thinking. They have to do with becoming more grounded and more nuanced, more nimble thinkers with more knowledge. At the same time, in the more nitty-gritty kind of way, David and I work very closely with students on their writing, editing, and turning, around several drafts often of each piece with very close attention to argument, clarity, range of sources, style, and those kinds of things. And yeah, we work really, really hard with students at that level. At the same time, outside of the courses that David and I teach, there are opportunities for MA students to take workshops in audio, data, photography, those kinds of areas, so that you can develop or at least be exposed to some basic skills in multimedia areas, data, and other things, and investigative reporting as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'll just build on what Alisa is saying about the skill of thinking with more uh, uh, depth, thinking more deeply, and with more authority and expertise. So we do a deep dive into ideas and into uh, the arts in our case and practice so that writers can write the journalists can write with more authority on subjects and not just like here's an example when I was an editor, I would find writers, kind of glibly throwing around language like avant-garde or postmodern, like I'd hear about avant-garde fashion or uh, postmodern makeup. Literally, those were literal examples, and maybe there is such a thing. But through a deep dive into these concepts in the program, the our we help writers learn how to write with more expertise and more authority and more knowledge, and then apply that knowledge to journalism in a variety of ways, not just long form written journalism, but we also do a podcast in the program. We also do in the MA Arts program. We do an investigative project in the MA Arts program. And the students can also learn to apply these skills, including the skill of thinking more deeply in a range of other platforms.
Um, I would say for people in the politics curriculum, the thing that I hear the most from students about what they appreciate a program are, I would say, two things. One is helping them think differently and conceptualize stories in ways that they would not have thought of before. And the other is what Elisa alluded to, which is a lot of hands-on editing so that their work can really improve word by word, line by line. On the first front, for example, we recently had into class a professor in the political science department who works on Vladimir Putin and authoritarian regimes. And so in that work, you learn that there are three main types of authoritarian regimes. You wouldn't normally think of it. You think an autocrat is an autocrat, but somebody who has like a personalist regime like Putin's, in which he is kind of everything and decides everything, is different than, let's say, Xi Jinping's authoritarian regime in China, which is essentially he's the leader of a party. And then you have authoritarian regimes who are there as part of a military junta. The personalist autocrat is somebody who really has to worry for his actual physical future. If he goes down, he risks dying or being sent to prison or meeting a very bad end, whereas somebody who is the head of a party is likely to be shuffled off into retirement and given a second-rank job in the bureaucracy. And so the behavior of those regimes is very different. If you begin to kind of understand the complexities of autocracy, you report about it better. Um, Another example would be last year, I had a student who was interested in Ukraine, is herself of Ukrainian origin, and she wanted to write about her experience in Ukraine. And because of reading that we did on nationalism, which stresses the importance of language and the formation of language in creating national identity. She did a fantastic piece about the revival of Ukrainian, even among Ukrainians who grew up speaking Russian, and did a wonderful piece, which she's now trying to develop into a book. I think those are the kinds of stories that might not have occurred to somebody had they not been exposed to the kind of things that we read and talk about in the seminar. And then the other is that kind of close editing. I think something that many of my students tell me is that they don't get a lot of editing in their current journalistic work. They're under deadline pressure. They bang out stories. The editor is overworked and slams it into print or puts it up online with relatively minimal editing. The idea of having two or three drafts of a story and going through them carefully and really looking at, is this paragraph really serving you in this story? Is this sentence the right one and is it in the right place? That kind of attention is something I find the students really, really appreciate, and hopefully they learn to metabolize those skills and make them part of their self-editing process as they go forward.
Great. And this a general question about kind of the admissions of how this works. Alisa, you already touched on this a moment ago, but what kind of experience should an MA student have in terms of just knowing kind of the ins and outs of journalism? And do they have to have journalism experience in the particular concentration that they're applying to? So would you have to have necessarily done politics reporting to be a good candidate for the politics concentration, or arts reporting to be good for the arts concentration?
You have to know how to report a story and organize it in a, logical and coherent manner. You need to have the skills that our MS program teaches. Maybe you did an MS somewhere else. Maybe you've been working as a journalist for 3 or 5 or more years. You need to be able to go out in the first weeks of the semester and report stories. You're not going to learn how to report stories in the MA. We take that as a given. In terms of arts and culture, you don't need to have covered arts and culture in the past, but you do need to have a deep interest in it. And for applications, there's a question, a specialization essay, and that asks, why are you applying to this particular program? And we really want to know, why do you want to focus in arts and culture? And we define culture pretty broadly. We do a lot of our curriculum in the seminar is about the arts, but we certainly touch on broader cultural questions like the anthropological question of what is culture or what are subcultures, other kinds of issues like that. But to the extent that students can sort of chart their own path in through the electives that they take, the thesis project that they write, that I know we're going to talk about a little later, it can be it can be broader than that. It can be a more sort of general cultural kind of subject. But we do want to see your interest in that area.
Yeah, I think the same applies to politics. Clearly, if someone chooses that, they have the interest in it. We define politics very broadly. There's lots of overlap, I would say, between some of the interests of the arts and culture people and the politics people. I've taught some of those students, and we find a lot in common. Um, um, we have had some exceptions. I have actually in the class right now somebody who didn't do traditional journalistic work, but worked for an NGO and worked for a consulting firm where we felt he had enough research skills and writing skills to work in our program, and I'm happy to report he's doing really good work. So there are occasionally exceptions, but as Alisa said, um, we don't want to teach the fundaments of journalism. We're expecting that to be something you already have. But of course, there always are reporting issues in stories of understanding where holes are in stories and where, so we do support and help people in the reporting process of trying to identify what does this story need that it doesn't have, and what kind of person should you be talking to that you haven't yet spoken to, and so forth.
Great. And we'll get into more of the concentrations themselves in a moment. But I thought I'd just take a moment to introduce our alumni, Alessandra and Luisa. And maybe I'll ask both of you quickly just to tell us kind of your reasoning for coming to the MA program. What were you doing before, and how did this particular program kind of stand out as the place to be for you?
Okay, can I start?
Hmm. Sure.
Okay. Sorry, I'm in the newsroom right now, so if I stop talking, probably because someone approached me. But well, I came to the what I was doing before. I was working as a reporter at Folha de São Paulo, which is one of Brazil's largest newspapers. I was covering basically human rights and politics in Rio de Janeiro. Now I'm still working at Folha, but in São Paulo and in the politics desk. Um, and I decided to take this MA because I knew I wanted to pursue a master's. I was actually leaning on doing a master's on political science because, like, my main goal was to kind of deepen my knowledge in some specific subjects, um, mostly like the democratic crisis and the rise of authoritarian populists. Like that was the thing I was most interested on. Um, but also again, like we we hear all the time how Colombia is the best journalism school in the world, and um, so having the opportunity to go to Colombia, and that made me think twice about doing the political science MA, and also because I thought that maybe I could benefit from learning a little bit more how journalism works in the US, and like how I could apply that in Brazil. Um, so yeah, eventually, and for personal reason, I also always wanted to live in New York. So like kind of all of that together came to my decision, and I ended up in the MA politics.
Great. Alessandra, what was your arts and culture story?
I don't think I'm necessarily the most typical applicant. I sw transitioned into journalism somewhat later in life, and I was freelancing for a local photography magazine. I was looking to level up my writing and also just find a place for myself in the industry, which was I felt really hard to crack into. I applied and was accepted to a couple programs in New York, NYU, and the New School and a CUNY, and then this program. Why I chose this program was for a few reasons. The first, the fact that it was concentrated in arts and culture, which is what I knew I wanted to pursue, that felt so perfect for me. Like, why should I waste my time doing anything else? I, looking at David and Elisa's work and their writing, I think that's like the perfect way to choose the program that's right for you is like look at who's teaching it and read their work. I wanted to write like them, so why not learn from them? And lastly, I guess I kind of wanted like the loophole of like being in a room of working journalists rather than like people who are on my same experience level. I know the power of networking and like building a community in the industry you want to succeed in. And so I wanted classmates who could help me out.
That makes sense. Great. So now we'll just talk a little bit more specifically about the seminars and the concentrations. I think for politics, Sandro, could you talk a bit about how there's a core seminar for politics as there is for arts and culture, but how is that kind of designed over the 2 semesters that the program kind of lasts, and what are some of the skills and kind of training people will get in the actual seminar itself?
Well, we we start with something very basic, which is state formation, which is something you kind of take for granted, the idea that we all live in countries that are in the UN, that have a capital, that have borders, that have passports and stamps and all of that. But that's actually a quite recent phenomenon historically, and understanding how we got there is really, really important, and understanding how different kinds of states function that will end up mattering a great deal actually on the ground. So it sounds kind of wonky, but then you move rather quickly to try to ask questions like, why does Afghanistan not have a tradition of a centralized state? Why is Iraq the mess that it is? And how do things like colonialism end up shaping or distorting the kinds of states that you have around the world? Um, Looking at things like what's known as the resource curse, how oil or other natural resources end up shaping the economy of certain countries, and in a way allowing states to avoid accountability and needing to consult their population in the decisions they make. So you start with that kind of building block, and then we move to related issues. I mentioned earlier, looking at nationalism. Why is it that human beings suddenly are prepared to die and kill for something called the nation, which was a concept that would not have made sense to people in the Middle Ages or even the Renaissance, let alone in ancient times? Um, and understanding how that operates, and how ethnic, but again, that's used to help people report on things like ethnic and religious conflict in societies, helping students decode situations that are quite confusing on the ground as reporters. You could be reporting on, let's say, an ethnic riot somewhere in India, and trying to understand the ways in which very often elite political actors will manipulate ethnic conflict for their own political gain. And so, in a sense, we're kind of trying to teach students how to read political situations and use some of that conceptual reading to help them analyze situations that can be quite difficult and confusing. Um, the um, the fall semester is quite heavily international, um, and the spring semester somewhat less so, although we have someone coming in who's actually a former MA student who's coming in this spring to teach the seminar, and he and I are consulting. But a lot of his background is also quite international. He's an American from Wisconsin, but he has reported in Haiti and Kenya and Germany. Wrote a book that was published about the far right in Germany. So at the same time, he's very interested in immigration, and I think is planning on doing quite a bit on immigration in the spring semester this year, having students, for example, spend a morning in immigration court, which has been unfortunately increasingly important in this last year because there have been many ICE raids that have taken place outside of immigration or inside immigration courts. So that's kind of the rough curriculum that we follow, and then hopefully at some point we'll talk about a lot of the other courses in the master's project, the thesis project, which is also very, very central to the experience of being in the seminar.
Great. And before we talk about arts, just in terms of the alums, you just mentioned one is coming back to teach the seminar this year. But can you talk a little bit about kind of what alums have gone on to do from the politics group over the years? I know they're in all sorts of different types of publications and outlets.
Yeah.
doing all sorts.
Well, so Ana Luisa's back in Brazil, but also one of our American graduates, Terry McCoy, is the Washington Post correspondent in Brazil. For some reason, we have a lot of people at the Washington Post. Casey Parks, who lives out in Oregon but works for the Washington Post. Abby Holsinger was at the Washington Post, but then moved on to the Financial Times recently, covering national security. Willa Ramus works at the Washington Post and covers tech. Um, Ben Taub is a staff writer at the New Yorker and writes on sort of security issues. Did a fantastic master's project about a terrorist case in Belgium, which became a kind of springboard for a lot of his later work. We have students working for The Guardian, for Abdi Latif Tahir was in Nairobi for the New York Times, but has now moved to Lebanon and is covering that. He's Somali of origin. So we have people kind of all over the place. We have, even though a student of mine didn't do video, she ended up doing video in her work and is now working with the New York Times for their video section. So people doing a lot of different things. I just attended this week a book event for a student from 5 or 6 years ago who was in the MA Politics, who just published her first book called Crossing the Line. That was based on, she's a Jewish American student who married a Palestinian man whom she met in Israel Palestine, and wrote a memoir that's also a quite political book about that experience. So people are doing a lot of different kinds of things in a lot of different places.
Great. And Alisa and David, could you tell us a bit about how the Arts and Culture Seminar is kind of designed over the 2 semesters people are here?
Sure. In broad strokes, we focus more on foundational issues and conceptual issues in the fall, and I think maybe Alisa could talk about that with more specifics. She's teaching the fall this year, and I'll be teaching the spring next year. And I think for the next few years, I'll be teaching the spring. And in the springtime, we focus more on arts in practice, and we look at issues like the art marketplace. How does the art marketplace work? We consider valuation. We bring in specialists from the Sotheby's to explain how art, our value, our the value of art is determined, and we do a tour of the Chelsea galleries. We talk about, dive deep into intellectual property and copyright law, arts policy, and in addition, have certain focus on criticism in the spring also, and do an investigative project. So it's jam-packed and it builds on the more conceptual material in the fall, which Elise will probably talk about if she wants to. Are you there?
Yeah, sorry. I couldn't get my unmute button out from underneath the admit button for somebody in the waiting room. Sorry. Yeah, that's a good summary of the sweep of the year-long seminar. As David said, in the fall we looked at sort of foundational conceptual issues like, what is art, what is culture, who counts as an artist, where do you find art, and some of the other kinds of concepts like David referred to earlier, like what is the concept of avant-garde or experimental work, and how do you apply that in the day-to-day work of journalists, or week-to-week or month-to-month work of journalists when we're working on longer pieces. So, for example, we engage that question by reading some theory and history and some examples on that concept, and then we bring in, as Sandra was talking about, experts from elsewhere at Columbia and sometimes outside Columbia. I brought in the film scholar Ronald Gregg, who's a specialist in experimental film, and we look at a number of short, weird and wonderful films from the 60s and 70s, and talk about how do we as cultural writers find language for describing and interpreting work the likes of which we've never seen before. And we do an exercise in the class with Professor Greg. And then meanwhile, the class is covering a performance festival that takes place every fall in New York that's put on by the Alliance Française. It's called Crossing the Line, and it includes dance, film, some visual installations and performance by artists from francophone countries mostly. And it's a for a lot of students, it's being thrown into the deep end. They're asked to write critical pieces about the kind of work that they've never seen before, and we hope applying some of the concepts that we've gone over through our reading about new forms and our practice with Professor Greg. We do a number of field trips on the question of where is an artist and who counts as an artist. One of the units we do is a tour of the street art in El Barrio, East Harlem. We do a unit on the question of commemoration and memorialization. This is one of our overlaps, I think, with politics. How do nations or different kinds of subcultural groups or ethnic groups publicly represent national or group traumas, for example, through museums, memorials, other kinds of sites like that. So we study a number of examples in class. And then actually tomorrow, the class is going to visit some of the memorials and monuments in the city. The memorial to the Irish hunger, for example, the AIDS memorial, and we'll also visit the 9/11 museum and have a meeting with the curator and head of that exhibit. So those are just a couple of the examples of the kinds of things that we do in the fall.
Great. And I guess just one last question for all three faculty as people might be wondering, what do you, aside from the master's thesis, which we'll talk about in a minute, what kind of things are they working on during the seminar? Are they producing academic work or are they doing journalistic work? And if so, what kind of, feedback and kind of editing are they getting in those
Yeah.
projects?
Journalism, 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 journalism. That's what they're here to work on. So in for the fall, they're writing a few pieces. As I just said, a review of one of the pieces in the Crossing the Line Festival. They're working on a piece. We do a little bit on history and archives and those kinds of materials, and they're doing I just received the pieces last night that I call Biography of a Hit, where they look at a work from before they were born, basically, and talk about why it was important in its moment and what it might have to say to us now. And they do a long profile involving of a creative person, someone that they have a lot of access to. They spend a lot of time with them in their studio, rehearsal room, whatever it may be, and talk to at least half a dozen additional sources to help contextualize this person. So it's not like the 800-word Q&A with an artist kind of quickie that somebody might do, which have their place, but this is more long form, deep profile about someone and their work and why their work matters. Those are the pieces that they're working on in the fall. And as David said, typically we do a group podcast project as well, that for some technical reasons isn't coming together this fall, but certainly we would bring it back next year.
Um, so I endorse completely the idea that Alisa articulated: journalism, journalism, journalism. One of the tricky things when you're exposing young journalists to a lot of the social science stuff is you hope they don't start writing like social scientists, who are often brilliant people but write terribly. And so we want everything to be good journalism, stories that are lively, that engage you, that draw you in with their lead, and that have artful structure. Um, I have them doing three medium-sized pieces over the course of the fall, um, each of which goes through two or three drafts that we work on very closely. In the case of the first assignment. We call it a country profile, but it can be, very broadly interpreted. So I've had students do, terrific pieces about, let's say, why there's, why potable water is only available in some parts of a country than in others, and then using something very specific to get at what that tells you about the way the country functions and where power is and where resources are. Um, um, my students just finished doing what we call an ideas story. And that again can be very broad. I had a student who's very interested in Ukraine, and his reporting came up with something that really seemed like a natural idea story, which is the idea of hybrid warfare. If one's looking at the way in which a lot of the sort of Russian campaign in Eastern Europe is being carried out, aside from, tanks and missiles and even drones, there's all sorts of use of civilians in a variety of roles, whether through cyber hacking and disinformation campaigns, um, having recruiting people online to do small acts of sabotage. They're sort of what we're in the trade of national security known as disposable agents. So you might just recruit some teenager to go do some single act, but unlike in traditional spycraft where you're developing an agent that you hope will be useful for years, you just sort of use them once and throw them away. So that seemed like a great idea. And then the idea was then to have him talk to people at military academies that study military strategy and talk about contextualizing, hybrid warfare within that context. We're then moving on to social movements at the moment in our curriculum. And so it's an opportunity to write about how people affect change in society, which can take many different forms from, very big macro attempts to enact regime change to smaller kinds of change. A student who wrote a very good story about this group Moms for Liberty, which is a conservative group that is trying to keep what they regard as sexually provocative material out of the hands of school children. Um, so you can, I have a student who's writing something about Indivisible, which is a movement, a kind of anti-Trump movement, and someone writing about Charlie Kirk's, Crossroads USA. So those are all important trends in terms of people who are trying to affect change in the world, which of course is, very much central to politics.
Great. And we'll get on to our alums in a second. I wanted to ask Alisa and David, though I know Sandro, you talked about where a lot of our alums have gone from the politics concentration. Alisa and David, can you talk a little bit about where the arts and culture grads have been going since finishing the program?
Well, much like the case with the politics concentration, our grads are sort of all over the place. We have grads working on a high level at the Guardian, at the Atlantic, doing freelance for the New York Times and also the Washington Post and other places. We have grads at NPR, and a handful who have written very impressive and important books. Uh, Sam Block, a graduate from a few years ago, just published a new book that's a radical look at kind of the quotidian subject, shade. Yashika Dutt, and I think five or six now grads who've done very highly regarded books. Uh, I'm not mentioning everybody. We've been, after 20 years, at least we could probably add a few more.
Sure. Glad to. Geez, we have the food editor at the Houston Chronicle and also another food editor at San Francisco Chronicle. We have arts and culture editor at the Huffington Post. We have a major producer at 99% Invisible. And just this is just last year's class. We have a student who's a fellow at the Columbia Journalism Review, taking advantage of fellowships opportunity for students after their graduate year. Two students landed jobs during the summer after graduation. One is a senior editor at the Palm Springs Life out in California, and one as the arts reporter for the Idaho Mountain Express. We have a couple students who are freelancing pretty well. One just came out with a great story in City Limits yesterday on built environment architectural story. We have a student who's working in the publications office of the Institute for the Study of War in Washington, which is an example of the occasional student who applies the great skills of journalists to an area that's sort of journalist adjacent. Um, those are the ones that just spring to mind off the top of my head.
And from my year, we have the managing editor at Interview Magazine, the to-do editor at Time Out New York, and, and editor at New Lines. Those are
And you.
three.
Right.
And I'm freelance.
And you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that comment.
And so, yeah, Alessandra, that's a natural segue. Maybe you can tell us a bit about some of the things you came away from the program with. We talked about why you came, but what are some of the skills, ways of kind of approaching stories in your work that have changed by virtue of going to the program?
I mean, so much. I think Professor Stille was saying this earlier about where I worked at magazines when I graduated, and you were just like pumping shit out and they were publishing it immediately. There's like never a moment in your life as a journalist where you will have 20 people and a professor like line editing your work and talking about what works and what doesn't and why is this sentence and is this the right word. That is so valuable, and you carry that with you within every project you do. I think we'll talk about the thesis at another point. Um, yeah, I think just how to craft a really interesting, engaging, like propulsive story and reading so much, good journalism, all of the stories that all the work that you are assigned is so helpful. You're just surrounded by really wonderful writing. I think that makes you a better writer.
And Louisa, from the politics side, what kind of things do you feel like you've kind of grown as a journalist by virtue of going through the program?
Mm, I think mostly on getting on a deeper level on the subjects that I was covering, deepening my knowledge on these subjects. And that, of course, because of the seminar discussions with Stille, was a great professor and a great editor also. And it's really nice to see you too, Stille. It's been such a long time. It seems like another life.
Mm.
Um, and Lemon, of course. And what I thought was really interesting was the opportunity to take classes in other departments. For sure, there was a class in the political science department, Professor Timothy Fry, that kind of changed everything for me after that. It was a class on autocracy and democracy, which we were also discussing these things on the seminar with Stille, but um, this was like a whole course. So like that, from that I came up with the idea for the master thesis. And when I came back to Brazil, the master thesis became like a huge podcast that I did here with funding from the Pulitzer Center. It was a podcast on authoritarian leaders that are uprising around the world. And so I traveled everywhere, like to talk to victims of them, to like explain who they were, like how they came to power. And, like today, like I feel like I'm a much more, mature, prepared, complete reporter than I was before, even for like writing analysis or even opinion pieces. So yeah, I think like that I grew a lot in the last few years, and that was like maybe mainly because of Colombia. So I'm pretty grateful.
Great, and that leads us to the master's thesis. We've been, talking about so many great aspects of the program. We only have about 10 minutes left to chat. So I think for the faculty, maybe you can tell us a bit about this master's thesis, which Annalisa was talking about in terms of, how students will kind of approach that and what kind of mentorship they'll have through the process of doing a big story while they're here.
I could start by, oh, go ahead,
Go
Oh,
Sandra.
ahead.
go ahead, David.
That by saying that the word thesis is a misnomer because we call the thesis for technical reasons that have to do with regulations, but it's really a work of long form narrative journalism, an in-depth work of long form narrative journalism on a timely subject that is deeply, deeply reported that the students work on from maybe around October through the end of the spring and working very closely with an advisor. It's with one of us, working on a weekly basis to take them through developing the idea, through a reporting plan, to you know, developing, shaping the reporting into a coherent story till the end to line editing. And maybe I'd love to hear some of Alessandra discuss the line editing process. We work literally word for word with the students. In fact, Alessandra, she's giggling. We had the idea I think we spent 2 days or something just going over your thesis. In the end, word for word, we thought, oh, we should start a YouTube channel called Word Futz.
Where we just play with words and talk about the best word for each sentence.
Because it was kind of fun.
And only nerds would tune in to that YouTube channel.
But it was fun. And the students have done some superb work. This year, one of the students is doing a piece on the cult of the iPod, and it takes up larger issues of materiality and the ownership society. So which is one of the goals of the thesis is through work of narrative journalism to take on big issues and big questions and theoretical questions but timely questions. Then another student is doing a story on why people don't dance in dance clubs today. I mean, not some people do, but why there's a shift in the behavior in the dance culture and what that says about the contemporary life among young people. Uh, and uh, and other things.
So I would say I often will tell students as they're beginning this process is this is an opportunity for you to write the best story you've ever written. You have an opportunity of 3 or 4 months to really dig into a topic, to report the hell out of it, to do so with the supervision of an experienced journalist who can help you make course corrections along the way, who will go through draft by draft, support you during the inevitable difficulties of the reporting project where source A, B, and C are not getting back to you, and how do you deal with that? Um, and it's produced some extraordinary work over the years. That's very, very varied. In politics, a lot of people choose to do international subjects, but I also encourage people to do American topics where they can really develop, long-standing relationships with their sources. But, I had a student do a great piece a couple of years ago about Chinese feminism. She spoke Chinese, but it wasn't possible to go to China for this story because it was dangerous with the sources. And interestingly, as we learned, almost all of the key figures of Chinese feminism had been forced to leave the country. Some of them were the United States, some of them were in London, some of them were in Italy. So she interviewed them outside of China and put together a kind of composite picture of what had happened to Chinese feminism as Xi Jinping was steering the country in a particular direction and wanted to boost the birth rate in China and viewed feminism as an enemy. So terrific piece. I had a student the year before that, who did an amazing piece about um, the LGBTQ community in Iran. He had originally hoped to go to Iran, but that was again was too complicated and too dangerous to do at the time. There were violent demonstrations in Tehran that would have made that very risky for both him and his sources. But he discovered that there was this whole community of people in Turkey in which LGBTQ people had been chased out of Iran and given sort of temporary asylum in Turkey, and they were all congregated in a medium-sized city in the middle of Turkey who were in a kind of waiting phase of their life. And he went there and interviewed them and came back with amazing stories of extraordinary persecution, but also perseverance on the part of this community that was living in, had gone from hell to purgatory, but was hoping for something better. But I've had students do an Australian student who did a fantastic project, which uh, won prizes on de-radicalization in American prisons, looking both at right-wing radicalization and Islamic radicalization and what the prison system was or wasn't doing to address that. So. It can work very well, whether one does an international project or a national one. And I think one thing I found very commonly, students will begin the process by saying, I can't imagine being able to write an 8,000 word story. I've never done anything more than 1,500 words. And I said, trust me, you will not have a problem when you've done all this reporting. And then, of course, invariably, the problem is quite the opposite. They've reported the heck out of the story. They've got tons and tons of material. I had a student last year who's Hungarian who handed in a 30,000 word first draft. And the thing that was funny about it was so good that I almost didn't know how to tell him how to cut it down. And in fact, he's turning it into a book now. So that 30,000 words actually ends up being very useful for him. He did end up finding a way to cut it down for the purposes of submission and also for the purposes of publishing, in a periodical basis. But ultimately, what he did, he had a vision of a very ambitious piece that, in fact, really did want to be a book, essentially, and that's what it's ending up being. But I think he started out very uncertain whether he could do a piece of 8 or 10,000 words, and it sure didn't work out that way. So I think it's just a great adventure for students to swim in deeper waters than they've ever swam before. And they find that, I think, pretty consistently one of the most exciting experiences in their time at Columbia.
And we're kind of running at the hour now, so maybe just for kind of a last few questions, Alessandra, could you tell us about your experience with the master's thesis? What was it like working with the faculty on that?
It was so fun. This was the first longer form piece I'd ever written. I chose the burlesque scene in New York City. I think one of the first things that David and Alisa said was like, where do you want to be spending your time this year? And I was like, a burlesque club is where I want to spend time. So it was so fun. I learned how to build scenes within stories, how to find sources, how to, enter subcultures and really like pull out a deep reported story. Since then, have worked on a couple, like 7,000 word investigative features for one for Vanity Fair, one for Rolling Stone, and it's been like the thesis project at Columbia was definitely like what has prepared me most for those journeys. And just quickly, David and Alisa spoke about a lot of the different like projects they assigned over the years. I was able to place all of those projects, including my thesis, and like get, paid for those. So, that's really cool that all of the projects are something that are interesting and engaging and current enough that like you can take those and pitch them and be paid for them.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Ana Luisa, you talked a bit about your kind of project and how it turned into this podcast. Can you tell people about the subject matter and how that kind of evolved? You said it was sparked a bit by the class you took outside of the school with Professor Fry, if I remember right.
Yeah, sure. So, like, on this class, we were delving to these authoritarian leaders, and one of them was Orban. And I kind of became basically obsessed with him, like trying to understand like how a leader from a post-communist country of 10 million inhabitants had become like this huge reference for the far right all around the world. So I did that for my master thesis. I went to Hungary. I tried to answer that question. I learned that it was a policy of the Hungarian state, like Orban was pouring a lot of money to attract conservative intellectuals from the US to go to Hungary, spend some time there, and then write uh, about Hungary and about Orban himself in a good light. And then when I finished the thesis, I was kind of like not enough to talk about Orban because they are all connected. So like then I asked for funding from the Pulitzer Center, and it became this huge project, which was the podcast, which was the most ambitious project I have ever done, and like that would not have been possible without the thesis and without having the opportunity to spend months um, reporting on this and having like the resources to do that, including financially. So like the master thesis, I think like it's one of the most interesting aspects of doing the MA. And I was also lucky enough to be oriented by Nicholas Lemon, which who might be maybe the most brilliant journalist on earth. Like he was so helpful and like he was all the time like trying to point out some holes in my reporting, and he made me think think about like things that I was sure about. He made me think about them like 1,000 times. And sometimes I was like, yeah, so I'm not that sure about it. You make me like really think like more profoundly about this. I was under the impression all the time that I was kind of under like a Socratic method. Like he was always trying to deconstruct everything that I thought that I knew, and like that was very helpful throughout the process. So yeah.
Great. And there's so much more we could talk about for the program. I know we've actually run past the hour, so unfortunately we won't get to talk about every great thing that you can do in the MA, but I thought maybe to close for our faculty, I know we talked about this at the beginning, but for people who are kind of, this has piqued their interest in applying, if they've started an application or if they're thinking of doing that still in the next month, what kind of stands out for you in terms of a strong MA application to the program?
I would say, yeah, our my colleagues may look at different things, but I always read the personal statements with particular interest because sometimes people work for publications that have very standard formats, and so you don't quite get an idea of their writing personality through the clips that they submit. Obviously, the clips are really important and they help you understand whether somebody has the reporting experience that we're looking for. But where I think students often really stand out is in the personal statement. You're entirely free to write about what you want and to write in the way that you are most comfortable writing. And so I've had, my most vivid impressions of prospective students have come through those personal statements where they've able to, one, explain a bit of who they are and what makes them tick and what matters to them, and to write it in a lively way that makes an impression. I remember one year reading someone's personal statement, and he had me laughing out loud like 3 times in a page and a half, and I thought, wow, this guy is fantastic. I hope he has the background, the reporting background to admit him, which luckily he did. Not that you have to make me laugh, but there are lots of ways to do this. But it's the idea of allowing your personality and your writing style to come through so that we see who you are. I think to me, that's the thing I look for the most.
I'd add to that. Yeah, I think those statements are important as well. And what I'm looking for in those, and in the specialization essay that I mentioned earlier, and yeah, of course the clips matter a lot too, is genuine intellectual curiosity, and a sense of how somebody puts a story together. Those essays are themselves a kind of form. We don't want to see a prose resume. We have your resume. So we want, we want to see what people have to say about their commitment to journalism and specifically to for us, the areas of arts and culture, what makes them tick, as Sandra said, and what ideas motivate them. That's really what we're going to be working with, and how they want to uh, participate in and become part of a mutually supportive community of fellow journalists.
I'll just echo what Elisa said, and what I look for in the essays is evidence that the applicant can think. I look for ideas and evidence that the applicant is comfortable in the realm of ideas and has ideas. And we'll see that in the clips too, but the essays are an opportunity to really show what makes you tick.
Great. That's great advice. So I think for anyone who's thinking about the program, as I mentioned, there's over a month to still put together an app. And if you have questions about the application itself and anything else related to the program, please reach out to us at apply.journalism@columbia.edu, and someone from my team will be happy to answer those questions there. We'll also have some more ins and outs kind of webinars about the application process, so you can learn more about the nitty-gritty of that in the next couple weeks as well. But I'd like to thank Professors Alisa Solomon, David Hajdu, Alexander Stille for providing such great insight into the MA program and the two concentrations we have, and for Alessandra and Ana Luisa for taking time during their workday to chat more about the experience of being an MA student too. So again, we hope to see all of you at another upcoming admissions event, whether it's online or in person, and we can definitely take any questions at that email address anytime. So hope to keep in touch very soon. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in. Take care,
Thanks
everybody.
to everybody for coming.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Great to see you, Alessandra.